You can't remember the last time you did something just because you wanted to. Every decision gets filtered through, what will they think? What if you've been performing for so long, you don't know what's real anymore? What if the person everyone likes isn't actually you? Living for approval means disappearing into expectations. And the scariest part? You've gotten so good at it, you don't know how to stop. Welcome to Unfiltered Adulthood, where we explore the quiet psychological shifts that reshaped you in your 20s, 30s, and 40s. If this resonates, subscribe and hit like. There's someone who realized something troubling while sitting in a restaurant. Their friend asked a simple question. "What do you want to order?" And they froze. Not because the menu was complicated, but because their immediate instinct was to scan what their friend was ordering and choose something similar. Something safe. Something that wouldn't make them seem difficult or high maintenance or weird. And in that moment, they realized they couldn't remember the last time they'd made a choice based purely on what they wanted. Not what looked good. Not what seemed appropriate. Not what other people would approve of. Just what they genuinely wanted. And the realization sat heavy. Because it meant they'd been living this way for so long, they didn't know who they were underneath all the performance. The pattern was everywhere once they started noticing it. The career they chose because it sounded impressive. The relationship they stayed in because ending it would require explaining why, and explanations invite judgment. The hobbies they pursued because they made good conversation topics. The opinions they expressed that were carefully calibrated to match whoever they were talking to. None of it was authentic. All of it was designed to manage how they were perceived. And the worst part was that it worked. People liked them. People approved. But the approval felt hollow because it wasn't for them. It was for a performance. For a carefully constructed version that had been optimized for external validation. They started to trace it back. When did this start? And the answer was unsettling. It started early. Childhood lessons about being good, being liked, not making waves. Praise that came when they made adults comfortable and disappointment when they didn't. A lifetime of subtle and not so subtle messages that their value was conditional. That love and acceptance were things to be earned through compliance and performance. So they learned to read rooms. To sense what people wanted and become that. To anticipate judgment and preemptively adjust. And they got good at it. So good that the performance became automatic. They stopped noticing they were doing it. It just became who they were. Or who they thought they were. But there were moments when the mask would slip. Moments alone when they'd feel a strange emptiness. A sense that they were living someone else's life. That the person everyone knew wasn't real. And in those moments, they'd feel something close to panic. Because if the performance wasn't real, and the performance was all anyone knew, then who were they actually? The career that looked so impressive on paper felt meaningless in practice. Not because the work was bad. But because they'd chosen it for the wrong reasons. They'd chosen it because it was the kind of career that made people nod approvingly at parties. The kind that parents could brag about. The kind that looked good on social media. But it had nothing to do with what they actually cared about. And that disconnect was exhausting. The relationship was similar. They'd stayed not because they were happy but because leaving would invite questions. It would require admitting something wasn't working. And admitting that felt like failure. So they stayed and performed contentment. And their partner probably knew. But they were both performing. Both maintaining an image of a relationship that looked right from the outside even though it felt empty from the inside. They started noticing how often they censored themselves. How many thoughts went unspoken because they might be judged. How many preferences went unexpressed because they might seem difficult. How many boundaries went unset because setting them might disappoint someone. And all of that silence was adding up to a life that felt increasingly distant from anything authentic. There was a moment at a dinner party that crystallized everything. Someone asked them about their opinion on something, and they gave an answer they thought the group would approve of. And mid-sentence, they realized they didn't actually believe what they were saying. They were just performing again. Saying what would maintain the image. And the person asking could probably tell. And that realization was crushing. Because it meant they'd been performing for so long that they didn't know what was real anymore. That the person everyone liked wasn't actually them. It was a construction. And they'd lost track of who they were underneath it. They tried to stop. Tried to make one decision that was just for them. Something small. What to eat for dinner. And even that felt impossible. Because every option got filtered through the same lens. Would this seem healthy? Would this seem indulgent? Would this invite comment? And they couldn't turn it off. The performance had become so automatic that choosing authentically felt terrifying. So they started smaller. They tried to notice when they were performing. To catch themselves in the act. And what they found was that it was almost constant. In conversations, they'd monitor their friends' reactions and adjust accordingly. At work, they'd present ideas not as they actually thought them but as they imagined they'd be most well received. In relationships, they'd suppress needs that might be inconvenient. And the exhaustion of all that performance was catching up with them. Because performing is work. And they'd been working constantly for years. Decades maybe. And they were tired. Tired of monitoring. Tired of adjusting. Tired of being whatever version people needed them to be. Tired of never being able to just exist without managing how they were perceived. The breaking point came when they realized they didn't know what they actually wanted. Not in small things like food. But in big things. What kind of life did they want? What made them happy? What were their actual values? And they couldn't answer. Because they'd spent so long optimizing for approval that they'd never developed a sense of self that was separate from other people's expectations. And that realization was both terrifying and clarifying. Terrifying because it meant starting from scratch. Clarifying because it meant they finally understood why everything felt so empty. You can't build a fulfilling life on approval. Because approval is external and conditional. And a life built on shifting external validation will always feel unstable. Always feel like it could collapse if you stop performing. They started doing something radical. They started asking themselves what they actually wanted. Not what would impress people. Not what would avoid judgment. Just what they genuinely wanted. And at first, they couldn't answer. The question felt foreign. Like asking in a language they'd forgotten. But they kept asking. And slowly, very slowly, small truths started emerging. They didn't actually like their job. They'd been pretending to because it seemed ungrateful to admit otherwise. They didn't actually want to live in the city they were in. They'd stayed because moving would require explaining why and facing judgment about the choice. They didn't actually agree with half the opinions they expressed. They'd just been mirroring whoever they were talking to. And with each small truth came a choice. They could keep performing. Keep maintaining the image. Keep living for approval. Or they could start building something real. Something that might not impress everyone but would actually be theirs. And that choice, that possibility of living authentically even if it meant disappointing people, was both terrifying and the most alive they'd felt in years. They started small. They disagreed with someone. Not aggressively. Just honestly. And the person didn't reject them. They just had a real conversation instead of a performance. And it felt strange. Vulnerable. But also real in a way that approval never was. They made a choice based purely on what they wanted. Ordered food they actually craved instead of what seemed appropriate. And nobody cared. The world didn't end. They weren't rejected. The approval they'd been chasing their whole life turned out to be far more fragile than the judgment they'd been avoiding. They started setting boundaries. Saying no to things that drained them. And some people were confused. Some people pushed back. Because they were used to the version that said yes to everything. But the people who mattered, the ones who actually cared about them, adjusted. And the ones who didn't. That was information too. The person who'd been living for everyone's approval started building a life for themselves. Not overnight. Not without setbacks. But gradually. One authentic choice at a time. One boundary at a time. One moment of honesty at a time. And what they found was that authenticity was uncomfortable. It invited judgment. It disappointed people. It meant giving up the security of approval. But it also meant finally feeling real. Finally inhabiting their own life instead of performing in someone else's. The career changed. Not to something more impressive. To something that actually mattered to them. The relationship ended or transformed into something honest. The friendships that were based on performance faded while real connections deepened. And the emptiness that had been there for years started to fill. Not with approval. But with something more solid. The sense of living a life that was actually theirs. The relief of no longer having to monitor and adjust and perform. The quiet satisfaction of choices made for the right reasons. You can't remember the last time you did something just because you wanted to. Every decision gets filtered through what others will think. And you've been performing so long, you don't know what's real anymore. But the person everyone likes isn't you. It's a construction. And underneath that construction is someone you've been ignoring for years. Living for approval means disappearing into expectations. But living for yourself means the possibility of actually being known. Really known. Not for what you present but for who you are. And the scariest part isn't that you've gotten so good at performing. It's that you have to choose to stop. That nobody can give you permission to be yourself. That the only approval that actually creates a life worth living is your own.